Hi, welcome to PhDizzle. I'm your host, Alice Chang, and today I am interviewing Dr. Kayleigh O'Keeffe, who got her bachelor's in biology from Amherst College, her PhD in biology also from UNC Chapel Hill, and is currently doing a postdoc at UPenn. So you have studied biology. Mm-hmm. What got you interested in biology in the first place?
Yeah, so I know a lot of people might have this story like, growing up in the woods and getting really interested in the environment or, learning about science growing up. And I learned science growing up too, just like anyone else. But I actually went to college and I had no idea what I wanted to do. So by that time, I thought maybe I want to be a math major, but I didn't really know what that meant and what someone does with a math major. And so when I went to college, I went to Amherst, and Amherst has an open curriculum, meaning that there's no required courses that you have to take except for when you major. You have to take the classes for your major. So my freshman year, I took 8 classes in 8 different departments because I was really soul searching, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until my spring semester that I took my first college level biology course. And it was with a professor who would ultimately become a mentor to me. She was my my thesis advisor ultimately, but at the time she was just the person in the front of the room in this class. And it was really the first time that I really met a scientist in real life. It was the first time that I really saw a female scientist in real life or otherwise. And the first time I was learning about biology through the lens of someone who was doing it. Someone who was, I think before, when I think about what I was learning in any science class, I was thinking about things that were done a pretty long time ago. I wasn't learning very much about what was going on more recently. And so I kind of got enamored with it. And then it was also very clear how passionate this professor was, and it was pretty contagious. So in that class, I remember I have this very vivid memory walking out of that class and calling up my mom and being like, I think I found it. After day 1 or day 2, I think this is what I want. But I didn't know until college.
So you decided to do a PhD. Did you do research while you were in undergrad?
I did. So kind of piecemeal. So that spring semester of my freshman year, I wanted to kind of start doing some research if I could. I was privileged enough, really, and I truly, now I really think volunteer internships are a terrible idea, but I did benefit from one of them in that I lived with my parents on Long Island that summer and volunteered at a microbiology lab at Hofstra University, which is in the town next to where my parents live. So that was really my first flavor of research in that that class that I took in the spring had a lab, but it was an ecology and evolution lab. So there wasn't that much molecular lab-based work. And so when I was doing this internship, I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so but I also had this feeling I should already know this. And so I was terrible about asking questions. And so I remember the professor was like, oh, you have to run a gel. So a gel being you amplify DNA to, if you're interested in looking at a specific sequence of DNA, you use a process called PCR to kind of amplify that fragment of DNA. And you can see how long that fragment is by visualizing it in this contraption. And it involves pipetting really small amounts of volume into this gel where it's hard to see what you're doing. And I remember just being frozen over I just didn't know what to do. And I didn't ask, because I've learned since, and I tell this to the people I work with now, ask the questions, right? And I do now, but at the time I didn't. And I remember the professor being like, have you done this before? And I was like, I have not.
Maybe.
But yeah, my research in undergrad, that summer was microbiology. The following summer was interning at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is in Maryland, in a lab that studies, at the time, really focused on blue crabs, and studying, kind of how doing surveys of the Chesapeake Bay, where the blue crab is such an important part of their economy. And then ultimately, I would do an undergraduate thesis with the professor who I first had biology with, studying the evolution of plant mating systems. So that also involved some field work, but a lot of lab work too. So I did do research in undergrad, but kind of a little bit all over the place.
Okay. So then when you went to grad school, you went to UNC, and how did you choose your lab and what did you study there?
Yeah, so I did go to UNC ultimately, but I did not go straight from undergrad to graduate school. So when I graduated, I first worked as a field assistant for a lab at the Yale School of Public Health, doing field work for a lab that studied tick-borne diseases. I study tick-borne diseases now, actually, which I'll ultimately talk about, or tick-borne parasites now, I should say, and I'll talk about the difference there. But I think that work is so important, but the field work for this type of work is so grueling. So, typically you're looking to avoid ticks, right? Like you don't want them. But I was looking for them on purpose. And so it involves taking a piece of corduroy cloth and dragging it through the forest and then flipping it over and picking off the tick. So the ticks kind of like grab to it. Yeah, it's really gross. But you also do this work, or I was doing it at least in the summertime in Connecticut. And like, it's not the South, it's not like as hot as it can be in the United States, but Connecticut is still very humid and very hot in the summertime. And, you're going for ticks, so you're wearing long sleeves and long pants. So, it was pretty grueling work, but I did also work for 2 years at a lab that studies obesity and metabolism. And so I think as this story continues, it becomes very clear that my experiences span like from the ecological to the biomedical. And I think it's in large part because like, I feel like I came to be interested in biology a little bit late, or at least that's how I felt. I will say I don't feel that way anymore, but at the time that's how I felt. So I had a lot of this like FOMO feeling where I was like, what if I'm meant to be a biomedical researcher, but I just haven't had the opportunity to experience it yet. And so I worked in a lab that studied obesity and metabolism at the at Tufts. It's in a center called the Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging. And so I worked there for 2 years. And ultimately, it was in that time that I both had my med school identity crisis, but also came to ultimately decide to apply to grad school. And so I had this med school identity crisis because I like really am interested in helping people. I like biology. But I was working in a lab where, I didn't see that many people on any given day. And so I couldn't really see how I was helping people really. And, I was like, oh, maybe I just don't like science enough that I like, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And I thought about going to medical school, and, I thought about it so much that I ended up taking physics 2 at night.
My God, that's dedication.
I was dedicated for a time because that was the one class that I needed still to apply to medical school. But I worked near the Tufts Medical Center. So I was often in medical school buildings. And I remember, as I was really kind of teasing out whether or not I wanted to apply, I remember this moment where I was at a salad bar in a line to go get salad at lunch. And there were med students that were studying in front of me in line. And I like peeked over their shoulder to look at what they were studying. And I was like, I don't want to do this. Like, I was like, I want to help people. And there are a lot of ways to do that, but like, I don't have to go to medical school to do that. And so it really was this moment where I came to realize that like scientists can also have like, it doesn't have to be like science all the time. Like you can also, value equally, if not more so, the community around you and that you want to help people and things like that and still be a scientist. And so I decided to apply to graduate school. It was graduate school really offers you the opportunity to develop an independent project. And so that really appealed to me as someone who was, a research assistant for a few years working on other people's projects. The idea of developing my own project held a lot of appeal. And I ultimately decided to go within the field of the ecology and evolution of infectious diseases. For a lot of reasons. I could see how it would be societally relevant, and I was really interested in communicating with the public on what I was doing. And it kind of went back to where some of my research experiences were, in that when we think about infectious diseases now, we're probably thinking about COVID. We often think more broadly about the diseases that impact humans, but diseases impact all organisms. And so my PhD was studying parasites that infect plants. When we think about infectious diseases, let's talk about COVID. You say I have COVID, which is caused by one pathogen, SARS-CoV-2. But oftentimes, things are infected by more than one thing at a time, which is also the case with plants. And so I studied what happens when a plant is infected by more than one parasite at a time. There's also microbes that don't cause disease that might be good for a host or even have no effect on the host. And I thought about how all these microbes that can infect the same thing interact with each other and how that affects how severely, in this case, a plant, but in general, a host organism, how severely they get sick, how quickly diseases can spread through populations, and how it affects the community. And so when I was looking for a postdoctoral position, I knew I wanted to think about going into a different system. I really enjoyed working with plants, and I actually think there is a very good chance I might go back to that ultimately. An appeal to me is that we learn all of these tools, whether or not they're lab-based skills or statistical skills and these questions, but they're relevant across systems. And so I was interested in kind of working on a system that is, clearly very relevant for humans. And so in this case, I joined a lab. My advisor in graduate school was Charles Mitchell. My advisor now is Dustin Brisson. And, ticks are vectors. So vectors are, it might be a bug that's transmitting diseases from, one organism to another. And in this case, our lab studies ticks, which is one type of vector. And when we think about ticks, we often think, I feel like I keep saying, like, when we think about this, but it's more complex, which is true. But
mosquitoes.
Yeah. So there's mosquitoes too. But in ticks, when we think about ticks, we usually think about Lyme disease, right? So Lyme disease is a disease caused by a pathogen called Borrelia burgdorferi, and it's transmitted by ticks. But ticks transmit a lot of different pathogens. There are also many different types of ticks, but the ticks that I study, which is a species called Ixodes scapularis, or the black-legged tick, can transmit actually a multitude of pathogens. And so, we're kind of getting at where the parallels between my PhD and postdoc are, in that I was interested in, these kind of multi-pathogen, multi-parasite systems and how that impacts, the diseases that they cause.
So you were talking about field work earlier and going in the summer and sweeping for ticks. So are you still doing that? Did you have to do that during grad school? Are you still doing that now? Are you just like, I'm going to let an undergrad handle it?
So in grad school, I did do field work. It wasn't tick field work because I was studying plants at the time. So I actually used a lot of different methods to ask the questions or investigate the questions that I was interested in. Sometimes it was lab-based, but a lot of times it was field-based. I think maybe the biggest field experiment that I had personally, there were some field experiments that I collaborated with other grad students in the lab, but there was an experiment that I collaborated with an undergraduate, Brandon Wheeler, who we were asking what happens when a microbe that's thought to be good for the plant. So that the name of that would be a mutualist, right? So a mutualism is an interaction between two organisms where they both benefit from that interaction in some way. So I studied a plant called tall fescue, which is actually a grass. It's actually thought to be the most abundant plant in the Southeastern United States. And so it often has this fungus that lives within it that can be a mutualist, can help the plant in a lot of different ways, especially fight against herbivores. So it makes herbivores sick. And we wanted to ask how this mutualist interacts with a parasite and how it affects spread of that parasite through a population. And so to do that, we got a little innovative. So ecology, there are very elegant tools that one might use. They're also kind of, trying to co-opt things that have other purposes for your own purposes. In our case, we bought and sold out 3 different stores of kiddie pools, like those round old school.
Oh my gosh.
Kiddie pools. We had, I think, 26 of them. So I had to drive this big suburban van to like all of these hardware stores and really just sell out all of their pools. But instead of filling them with water, we filled them up with soil and planted these small populations of this grass. And some of the populations had the mutualist and some of it didn't. And we watched how the parasites spread through it. So that was field work where you asked if I punted to undergrad. So he and I did that together. And Brandon's actually a graduate student now. So that was field work that he and I did together. So I did do field work in graduate school. I do not do field work now. And it's not because I punt my field work to to undergraduates. It is because of a collaboration. So, my lab has a fairly long-standing collaboration with the New York State Department of Health, and they've been surveying and sampling populations of ticks throughout New York State for the last 2 decades, all across the state. And so they have a collection of ticks. And at that time, over those years, they extract DNA from those ticks and store it in their freezers. So they have this massive collection of tick DNA. More than 70,000 ticks are represented by this collection. Wow. So I don't do my field work because they just send me that DNA and I work with it.
Crazy. Wow. I didn't even know they had such programs.
Yeah. They do often for things that are like, of public health concern, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. So you still get to help people. And even though you're working with, I guess, more on the animal side, but it's for the purpose of helping people. So it kind of ties all together, right?
Would I say that? Yeah, I would say my science isn't really like directly applied. So there's like applied science and basic science. Applied science, your results would have direct applications to, management strategies. And that may ultimately come from the work that I do, but I think it typically falls more in the basic realm. But the helping people side, I've, in the last few years especially, have done that more through trying to communicate my science to younger audiences, as well as through teaching, which is a big passion of mine. It's always been kind of what drove me through a lot of graduate school. That's kind of where I think I've been trying to help people and through mentoring, through undergraduates like Brandon and other undergraduates I've worked with through the years.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think there's a whole human element that people don't talk about in science, where it's like you're in the classroom, you're mentoring other people in the lab. And it's not directly, I'm helping a patient, but there's a larger sphere of influence.
Yeah, that was something that was really challenging about the last year and a half, among many other things that were very challenging about the last year and a half, was that for a really long time, either undergraduates weren't at Penn at all, or their access to lab was really limited. And so, I worked with an undergraduate over the last year and a half, I guess, Emma, who is now a research technician in Alabama, and she was doing lab work with me and then couldn't do it. And so she and I had to come up together with something she could work on remotely. So the mentoring side of things was for everyone, was really challenging when we had to go remote. So
you've been in academia, you've kind of changed labs, tried different things. What's next for you? Do you want to stay and do research? Do you want to stay in the classroom and teach? What are you thinking?
Yeah. So when I think very much colored by my undergraduate education at a small liberal arts college. So Amherst College is in the same town as UMass Amherst. UMass Amherst is I think would be considered the flagship UMass school. There are many UMass campuses. It's a big state school. Amherst College is very, very small. It's it's smaller. It was smaller than my high school by like 1,000 students. So my graduating class, I think, was like 450 people. Oh, wow. So super, super small. And so I had there are many small liberal arts colleges, but I think colored by my experiences as a student at a small liberal arts college, I've always been interested in teaching at one in the long term. So, or more broadly, the jargon term is a PUI, or a primarily undergraduate institution.
Okay.
And so in graduate school, I knowing that was a goal of mine, I taught at a small liberal arts college in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is where NC State is, which was about 30 minutes away from Chapel Hill, where UNC Chapel Hill is. I taught at Meredith College, which is an all-women small liberal arts college. And so I'm really interested in teaching. I've always been really interested in teaching. I'd love to teach, or let me correct myself. So I've always loved the idea of teaching at a primarily undergraduate institution. I think something that I'm challenging myself to do now is to explore. I think a lot of PhD programs train you for an academic position, whether or not, really the research intensive one, but like maybe peripherally so these more kind of undergraduate institutions. There are actually many positions within academia and otherwise that, are involved in teaching, are involved in like teaching development, faculty development, best practices in education.
Interesting.
So what I've challenged myself to do this semester is to kind of explore what those options are. Not because I, have totally pivoted in what I want in the long term, but because I think it's important that we do this sort of information gathering. So that's something that I'm doing actively right now.
And it's kind of nice that you are, Penn is a bigger school in terms of like it's a more diversity in what they do in the research. And so I think it's a great place to explore and have the opportunity to explore those things. And I guess, are you also looking outside of academia, or are you just looking at opportunities within academia?
I think I'm still just looking within academia. And I also I may ultimately do this kind of soul searching, if you will, and decide to do exactly the same thing I've always wanted to do.
Well, it's good to know. Like, otherwise you'd be like, oh, what if I did that, or would I have liked that? So when you have the time, it's so good.
Right. I think anyone can be a scientist, no matter who you are, no matter what identity.
I love that. So daytime Kayleigh, biology, nighttime and weekend Kayleigh, what are you doing in your spare time, if you have any?
Yeah, I do have it. Yes, I think it's important. We're all, scientists, do science, but they're also humans, just like anyone else. So I always tell people that I dread the what are your hobbies questions, because I always feel like I don't have any hobbies. But in grad school, I feel like each year I was searching for a new hobby. So one year I took guitar lessons. One year I got into running. Discovered I hate running, so I don't get into that.
That's good to know.
Yeah, but more recently, and this is something that I was interested in before quarantine, but kind of engaged with more during quarantine. Since graduate school, really, I started going to these storytelling events. So it's really neat. I think a lot of folks don't know about it. I didn't know about it until I moved to North Carolina. There was this organization in North Carolina called the Monty, which would have these story slams. So you would buy a ticket, and when you bought the ticket, you said whether or not you were interested in telling a story. And then they would pick people's names out of a hat, and they would share their stories.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. So they were usually on a certain theme, but in graduate school, I went to these events all the time. I thought they were great. I never put my name in the hat. Never something I didn't think I had anything interesting enough to share. I wasn't going to do it. And I was always very impressed by people's stories, not just I should also say that they are personal narratives. So it's not like a story that they're making up. It's a story about, or should be a story about themselves. And so when I moved to Philadelphia, and I moved here 2 years ago, there's an organization that does that in Philadelphia too. It's called First Person Arts. And so I started going to their story slams, still not putting my name in the hat. So it ran very similarly still, where you put your name in the hat as you come in if you want to tell a story. I never did that because, again, it still felt like that I wasn't ready for it. And then the shutdown happened. And I was stuck in my house. There's another organization called Story Collider, which is actually a science storytelling organization.
Oh, interesting.
So they are kind of a multi-pronged organization. They have a podcast where they share stories weekly. They often have workshops where they travel around the country and teach people about storytelling. But of course, that was limited over the last year and a half. So they started offering these workshops for individuals online. And so I started taking storytelling classes. So introduction to storytelling. I just finished a storytelling class yesterday on storytelling in the classroom, how to use humor and storytelling, things like that. And of course, a lot of the events that one might share stories in look a little different these days. Maybe they're starting to enter in person, but over the last year and a half, mostly have been virtual. So I did put my name in the hat at these virtual events and told some stories that I worked on in these classes. Science stories could look like, let me tell you a story about me doing lab work, and some people do that, but their definition of what a science story is very broad. And so the one that I told most recently so my partner is an academic, but he's a MD PhD. So he's a medical doctor, as well as a PhD, he's a geneticist. For medical school or for residency, there's this, in my opinion, terrible process where they interview for all these residency programs and then have to submit a list where they rank all the programs that they like the best. And these programs submit lists where they rank all the applicants they like the best. And then some algorithm matches them and you find out all on the same day. Yeah. So it's a lot of buildup. And so I told a story about what it was like for me as the partner during that story. And so I talked about my science during that, and that my partner and I were long distance for 4 years while I was in graduate school and he was in med school and grad school, and talked about what that meant for me and kind of the struggles of, both partners being an academic, that sort of thing. So, is that about science explicitly? Not really, but I am a scientist and that is something that I experience. So it is really broad. But I also told a story about how I got stuck in a car in a snowstorm coming out from a job interview when I was in college, which has not very much to do about science at all. So,
well, I kind of like it because, you were saying, oh, I don't really have hobbies or, whatever. Sometimes you think oh, my life's not that interesting. And then when you're forced to tell a story about it, you think of all the details surrounding that. And you're like, oh, yeah, that was an interesting scenario I was in. Oh, I have multiple stories to share.
Yeah. And we all have stories to tell, right? So storytelling in the classroom class that I just took was certainly focused, I took it out of my interest in teaching, but it really was talking about how to be a good story listener and how to help other people bring out their own stories. And so we do really all have stories to tell. And I think through these classes, I realized that about myself. But yeah, so I do storytelling. We adopted a cat about a year ago. So
amazing.
His name's Bagel. And in the storytelling class that I took this week, one of the exercises required us to come to class ready to talk about 3 things that we could talk about forever. So 3 passions that we could talk about forever. And I felt in the same way that I panicked under the "what are your hobbies" question, I panicked under that question. So I asked my partner, I was like, what am I passionate about? And he said, teaching science and our cat Bagel.
No, just your cat Bagel, but not teaching science to Bagel.
I haven't taught science.
You should try that. That would be a fun story.
Bring it all together, all my passions in one. So he's very mischievous. So I mean, it's not a hobby. But I do spend a lot of time trying to make sure he doesn't hurt himself. Yeah. And then I really like live music. I went to my first concert in a year and a half on Wednesday.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
What kind of music do you like? Or do you not? Does it not matter to you?
Someone asked me the other day what genre the person I saw on Wednesday is. And I think it's a mix, maybe folk, rock, but elements of reggae, and he raps in some of his songs. So it's really kind of all over the place. Yeah, it was really neat. The concert I went to on Wednesday was of a musician who over quarantine. Well, I've been listening to him since my freshman year of college.
Wow.
So for 13 years, I realized while I was in this concert. And
Wow.
he over quarantine on Thursday evenings would have like a Facebook Live concerts, and everyone would join in, and it was like really lovely. And my partner is a doctor, and so would come back from the hospital because he, obviously still worked over that time, and we would watch these concerts. And the concert I went to on Wednesday was very small. There were only like 25 people there, so I got to like thank him afterwards for that sort of stuff.
That's amazing. That's cool. And hopefully, things are opening up more and you'll be able to do more live music and see, like, if that specific artist, see him more too. That's great. PhDizzle.
Having fun with smart people doing cool things.